Welcome to Interviews from Mexico. I'm Laura Carlson, and I'll be your host as we look at cutting-edge issues with the men and women who know them best. Here on Telesur. One of the most tragic results of the war on drugs here in Mexico and the violence it has unleashed has been the alarming rise in disappearances. For a family who loses a loved one to forced disappearance, there's a limbo of not knowing what's happened to your son or daughter or aunt or uncle or sister or brother. These families have faced this problem by organizing and by pressuring authorities to bring results and to search for the disappeared in Mexico. Today, to talk about this problem of disappearances, we're very fortunate to have with us here in the studio Santiago Corcuera. Santiago, thanks so much for being with us here on Interviews from Mexico.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Santiago is an expert in disappearances. He's the founder of the Human Rights Program of the Iberoamerican University here in Mexico City, and also a former chair of the Committee on Forced Disappearances of the United Nations. Santiago, many people might not know exactly what we mean by forced disappearances and the social problem that it is, especially here in Mexico, and the dimensions of the problem that we've seen in the last 10 years in the country. Could you give us a general overview of what we're facing here?
Yes, of course. I think the first thing is that we have to define the concept and distinguish forced disappearances from, for example, kidnapping or abduction.
There's a legal distinction there.
There is in Mexico a very clear distinction. A kidnapper is looking for something back, a ransom.
Yeah.
And the disappeared person is the one that is deprived of his or her liberty, mainly by state agents or by private parties who act with the acquiescence of state agents, and thereafter the whereabouts of that person is unknown, either because the state refuses to provide information about the whereabouts or the fate of the person, or because, more cynically, if the state recognizes that the person was deprived of his or her liberty, the state refuses to provide information as to where that person is or what happened to him or her.
So are we usually talking about a cover-up here or forms of complicity?
Sometimes there is a lot of complicity between, for example, police forces and organized crime, like the emblematic case of the 43 students that were disappeared in Iguala, the students of Ayotzinapa, who were firstly taken by the police and then delivered to the organized crime. So that is typically forced disappearance proper.
Now, in your work on the committee and formerly also as the chair of the working group on forced disappearances, you saw this as a global problem.
Correct.
Is what's happening in Mexico similar to what's happening in other parts, or what are the distinctive characteristics of the problem we're seeing here in Mexico?
Yes, absolutely. That's a very pertinent question because the scenarios are not the same. For example, typically, the concept of forced disappearance was derived from the situation of the military regimes in Argentina, Uruguay, and Chile in the 70s and 80s. Of course, the context there was political persecution, and there was no war, so to speak. There was no internal armed conflict. There was political persecution. And students and activists and journalists were abducted by the state and then killed or kept for very long periods of time in clandestine places. That is one context, and probably our audience would normally refer forced disappearances to situations like Argentina, Chile,
Yeah.
Uruguay, and other parts where there were military regimes that persecuted political adversaries.
And they've had the longest time organizing to search for those people
Sure.
and making the issue visible.
We have to recognize the value and that the families of the disappeared had in creating the international legal framework.
The mothers of the Plaza de
The
Mayo.
Madres de la Plaza de Mayo, las Abuelas de la Plaza de Mayo, for example. That's one context. There is, this situation also happens when there are internal armed conflicts, like in Guatemala, where more than 40,000 people were disappeared during and as a result of the revolution in Guatemala, or in El Salvador. And also contexts like the one in Colombia, where there was or is, or an internal armed conflict that was denied by the government for a very long time, but undoubtedly there was an internal armed conflict, and also organized crime in Colombia. So probably, although comparisons can always be deceiving or sometimes cannot be completely accurate, the Mexican context is, let's say, more similar, although not identical, to the situation that happened in Colombia, than the context in Argentina or Chile or Uruguay. Now, in Mexico, in 2006, December 2006, President Felipe Calderón decided to start this so-called strategy against organized crime by using the armed forces, the Mexican army mainly, to, as they say, combat organized crime, rather than...
As they say?
Yeah, because really it's not combat. Combat is what an army performs against another army.
A clearly identified army on a battlefield.
Either internal or foreign, where there is war.
And this is a crime situation.
And the problem is that since that time, the president and the, let's say, the propaganda of the government was that it was a war against drugs, which is not a war, because really drug dealers are not soldiers. Their cartels are not armies, even though they are very powerful and very strong. They are not armies, and therefore you cannot combat them. You, of course, have to persecute them, detain them, judge them, and sanction them. But the problem is that by using the armed forces, they are not trained to do that. They are trained to kill.
And we're talking about an enemy that's not even clearly identified.
It's very movable.
And so we have this phenomenon of extrajudicial executions.
Absolutely.
So how many people killed that may not even be part of this
during
enemy.
that 6-period time, that is the administration of Mr. Calderón, the rate of violent killings in comparison with the previous 6 years rose 300%. The special rapporteur on extrajudicial killings, when he came to Mexico at the beginning of the administration of Peña Nieto, said that he had interest in coming to Mexico because he had received information that during that 6-year period, there 120,000 people were violently killed in Mexico. Then, at the end of President Fox's administration, there was this big march, this big demonstration in the streets of Mexico City, where people were demanding security because they had news or reports that around 560 people had been kidnapped. Now, that was the balance that administration left. Calderón left this country, or Calderón's administration left this country with 26,500 disappeared persons, which is a difference between kidnappings and disappearances. 26,500 persons officially recognized in a list, recognized in a list prepared by the Mexican Attorney General that was kept hidden by that government. And there was this leakage where the Washington Post said, I have this list, which apparently was prepared by the government itself with 26,000 names here. And then when the administration of Peña Nieto took office, the government admitted, yes, indeed, this list was prepared here, and it has more than 26,000 names of persons that have been disappeared. Now, of course, that figure has increased because during the administration of Peña Nieto, the strategy remained, even though let's say the intensity of the strategy was reduced during the first 4 years, and disappearances and killings continued. Then the last 2 years, 17 and 18, the indexes went up dramatically in extrajudicial killings, or let's say arbitrary killings, or executions. And official number nowadays of disappeared persons in Mexico is of around 37,000. So this trend, unfortunately, has continued.
And that's officially.
What is the cause? The original cause is the wrongful usage of a force which is designed for war to make it perform activities that are that should be performed by police forces.
So ironically, it's a security policy that detonates the crisis in public security.
Absolutely. That is undeniable. That is empirical evidence. And that is why we are so tragically frustrated about the simulation, about the approval of this new so-called National Guard, which is not a civil corporation, is not a civil body, because it will be fed, integrated by elements, if you say that in English, I mean members of the Army and of the Navy.
That's a strong statement. Let's go back to the family members, because when you mentioned this list that was leaked to the press at the end of the Calderon administration of 26,000 disappeared people in the country, by then family members knew what was going on. They didn't know the numbers, but they've begun under the Movement for Peace and Justice to come together and begin to say something's happening here, something terrible is happening in the country. And they have continued to organize and to press for changes. One of the achievements of these movements, these organizations, was a year ago the
enactment of the
law of
General Law on
National Disappearances. Tell us, what's your evaluation of that year, of that law 1 year later?
First, Laura, I want to thank you for giving credit to the victims, because it is really their effort and their struggle, their quest against disappearances that gave rise to this very good law, which is unique in the world. It has, of course, its limitations, its challenges, but it is a very, very good law. And it is because of the families of the disappeared that exercised a lot of pressure in order to have uniformity in the legal framework on disappearances in the country. Because as Mexico is a federation, each state had, for example, to introduce the concept of disappearances in the criminal codes. Some states did not do it, or did it wrongfully, without accuracy, and the definition was wrong. The federal criminal court was in that situation, so they said we need one general law that is applicable in the whole territory and that is binding on all authorities of the country, whether federal or state
Standard
authorities.
definitions, standard protocols.
Correct. Standard protocols, obligations of the state authorities with the federal authorities to coordinate one national system for the search and not 33 systems that did not talk to each other and did not understand each other.
And half the time didn't search anyway.
And exactly. So that is the outcome and the reason, the original reason of that law and the outcome of the law. Now we have legal uniformity. And that was, of course, also backed up by the recommendations of the Working Group on Forced Disappearances when it came to Mexico in 2011, and then the recommendations of the Committee on Forced Disappearances in 2015, in February. So then, in 2017, the law was finally passed by the Mexican Congress, and it entered into force on the 16th of January of last year. So actually we are now, let's say, we cannot say we celebrate something that should not exist, but it was something that we needed to have. So let's say we are commemorating the first anniversary of the entry into force of this law.
On a state level, which is where it becomes most applicable, the victims have to go first to the state authorities. In the case of a disappearance, how's it working so far? What are the obstacles that we've seen?
Well, the problem is that the law has been in force already for a year, but the implementation is still very far away from being fully implemented. Very far away. We are far back. For example,
we've certainly seen that before
the law,
in Mexico.
Absolutely. This apathy or disdain that local authorities show before the tragedy is really something that makes everybody angry.
Yeah, so many families report that, and it's hard to understand on a human level. I mean, is it a lack of political will?
Absolutely.
Is it a cover-up?
It's lack of political will. Because they have the obligation. For example, the law says that each state of the Republic has to establish a search commission, that each state of the Republic has to appoint a special prosecutor, especially devoted to investigate disappearances, that it has to enact laws regarding the declaration of absence in case of disappearances. And if you see how many of those states have complied with those obligations, you would cry. We have around 10 in one case, 6 in another case, 4 states that have enacted the law, the other states haven't. So that is disdain on the part of the governors and on the part of the legislatures of the states of the Republic.
And that's just getting the legal framework into place, because
that
then
is
there's
the
still the
implementation of the
day-to-day.
general law.
Yeah.
So the level of frustration of the families has a limit. I mean, they really struggled. They finally obtained what they wanted, this very good law. But one thing is a declaration, like what a law says and does. It declares things, principles, it orders actions, and quite another is putting that into practice, you see.
Well, you've worked very closely with the organizations of families that, unfortunately, but fortunately for political change in the country, have developed in states all over the country.
Good.
In that work, what has been their role in this issue? Because there was an evolution. After that frustration of meeting up with insufficient laws, of insufficient action on the state level, they turned to these forms of grassroots organization that didn't abandon the pressure on the governmental authorities, but also began to carry out activities of public awareness, of search itself, on a local and a national level. What do you think their role has been?
I really have to express my admiration and respect to those women, mainly, because, you know, just as we can say that the majority of the direct victims of disappearances are men, because that is true, that is statistically demonstrated. It is also true that it is women who suffer the consequences of the disappearance of their loved ones.
Broken families, loss of income.
Women that not only do they have to work and seek the income necessary to support their families, but also search, because the authorities do not search. Yeah. They have become the investigators, the persons who actually go to the sites, to go to knock on the door of the authorities to try to obtain information as to where her son is, for example.
Well, we have only 1 minute left in the show, but I wanted to go straight from there to the fact that now, as we speak, the 4th National Search Brigade is in the state of Guerrero with 150 family members carrying out a search. What's the value?
It is them that search. It is them that actually perform what the state should be doing. That is why it's so admirable, their courage to continue in this quest against disappearances in this country.
Well, we certainly hope that with these efforts of families, from the depth of their pain and their grief, that we can generate, that they can generate response from the society and pressure the authorities to finally use these laws. Yeah. and to end this tragic situation.
And let's just say that they do not deserve the society's mercy or the government's mercy. They need justice. We should not pity them. We should only give them what they own, which is the truth.
Well, that's a great note to end on, an important point. Thank you so much, Santiago Corcuera, for being with us.
Thank you so much.
And thank you. We'll be back next week on Interviews from Mexico.